If the world hoped amidst broad-based international condemnation that Vladimir Putin would blink, it's been disappointed so far. Instead, Putin's army shells cities and many civilians are fleeing Ukraine. What explains the Russian president's willingness to make Russia a global pariah? And how much of it is ultimately about reclaiming Russia's place in history? Let's find out as we ask in Vienna, Austria, Ivan Krastev, chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies. In Washington, D.C., Walter Russell Mead, Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship at the Hudson Institute and the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal. In Villanova, Pennsylvania, Lynn Hartnett, Professor of Russian History at Villanova University. And in the capital city of the province of Ontario, Seva Gunitsky, Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. And we thank all of you for making time for us here on TVO tonight. Walter, let me start with you. We all remember Winston Churchill's famous expression of Russia being described as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. 80 years later, you have written that Western leaders have not, quote, fathomed the gulf between Putin's world and their own. Talk to us about that gulf. What is that?
Well, let's just take one example. In the West, we tend to think that freedom works, that tyranny will always fall of its own weight. But if you think about Russian history, you see the czars lasted a pretty long time. When they fell, it wasn't really to a democratic revolution as much to the Bolsheviks. Stalin died peacefully in bed. And then when the Soviet Union finally did collapse, the liberals and Democrats who struggled feebly for power in the 1990s ultimately failed. So Putin starts thinking about the world in a different way than people in the West often do.
Ivan, I will put this to you. You wrote this 3 days after Putin gave the order to attack Ukraine. You said, first, we must understand that this is not Russia's war, it is Mr. Putin's. He comes from a particular generation of Russian security officials that never managed to reconcile themselves with Moscow's Cold War defeat. In front of their eyes, the Soviet Union vanished from the map without military loss or foreign invasion. For them, the current assault on Ukraine is a logical and necessary inflection point. The imperial table can once again be reset. These people are not interested in writing the future. They want to rewrite the past. Follow up on that, if you would. What past is Mr. Putin trying to rewrite?
Mr. Putin is not about restoring Soviet Union. Mr. Putin is about restoring what he believes is historic Russia. And this is quite important to keep in mind with two things in mind. In 1989, 1990, basically when the Soviet society was trying to get out of communism, Mr. Putin was not in Soviet Union. He was in East Germany. And as a result of it, when you see such type of a dramatic changes in your own society from outside, quite often you really don't understand what is going on. You are just puzzled. You cannot understand. You have a nuclear power, superpower, which just disappeared. And he was one of those paid to basically guard Soviet Union, and none of these people did anything to do it. So this kind of also sense of guilt and self-hate and the idea that he's going to restore Russia. But secondly, he was in Germany and he was the witness of the German reunification. And when you're reading his famous essay from July last year, in which he's talking about Russians and Ukrainians being the same people, on the page first, he's talking about the wall that has been built in the last years between Russia and Ukraine. So he was trying to imagine it. In his imagination, he really believes that he's destroying a wall. For him, Ukraine is just East Germany. And the only problem in this view of the world is that the Ukrainians don't think this, and they're fighting him. And this is why when he said that, or I still am convinced that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, paradoxically, he's the last one who remained convinced in this, because he really, in my view, expected that Russian army is going to be met as liberators, particularly in the Russian-speaking east part of the country, probably not in Lviv, but at least in some of the cities that he's shelling now and where people are resisting. So from this point of view, the paradox of Putin is that, at least in my view, he should be read very literally. Because he's an intelligence officer, we try to believe that he's very deceptive. But part of the story these days is that he's saying what he thinks, and the passion and the intensity and also kind of refusal to believe that what he sees with his eyes happening in Ukraine is really what is happening. I do believe this is what we see, and this is about what he sees as historic Russia, and he cannot accept the fact that the Ukrainians do not agree with him.
Okay, let's talk DNA. Lynn Hartnett, I'm going to put one of your points back to you and get you to amplify on that. In a recent piece about Russian history, you suggested that the expansion of the empire is written into Russia's DNA. So is Putin enacting that now, in your view?
Yes, I believe that he is. I think that his conception of what it means to be Russian and the strength of Russia is grounded in this idea of an imperial mission, a civilizing imperial mission, if you would, where he conceives of Russia like the czars of old, as a civilization that is somehow great, that can bring its uniqueness to other peoples. And because Russia as an entity was born as an empire, it's hard to move beyond the sense of imperialism as an essence of Russianness and Russian nationalism.
And Seva, let me put this to you because, again, all of our viewers, well, everybody around the world, frankly, is trying to understand what has prompted and what is motivating what appears to be just a massive miscalculation on Putin's part. But here we go. Alexander Kwasniewski, former president of Poland, has spoken of a private conversation that he had with Putin in 2002 in which he asked him who were the greatest figures in Russian history. And Putin is supposed to have answered Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Stalin. And Kwasniewski's impression was that Putin clearly wanted to be number 4 on that list. Do you imagine that that is what is motivating all of this?
Well, after the last few weeks, it's very hard to actually say what Putin really believes, or at least we should be cautious about it. But I think he's sincere in thinking that the core of Russian identity involves Ukraine and Belarus as a part of it. And I hope after the events of the past couple of weeks, people finally stop calling Putin this unreformed Soviet man. And I hope it puts to rest all the times that famous line of his has been misinterpreted about the Soviet collapse being the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, because it's clear that Putin does not want a return to the USSR. He holds the USSR in some contempt for its failures. He spent a surprisingly long time in his speech criticizing Lenin for inventing the concept of Ukraine. So he's a traditional Russian imperialist who sees control over Ukraine and Belarus as part of that identity. I think many people saw his dismay about the Soviet collapse as nostalgia for the Cold War, but he means something else, the collapse of the Russian Empire. And I don't think many people miss communism today in Russia. The end of the Cold War signaled an ideological collapse of communism that was welcome, but this geopolitical defeat is something that is seen as a disaster and continues to be seen as such.
Let's hear Putin in his own words, shall we? Here is a clip from an interview he gave back in 2016.
Человек, или сказать пошире, человек русского мира, он прежде всего думает о том, что есть какое-то высшее моральное предназначение самого человека, какое-то высшее моральное начало. Конечно, мы менее прагматичны, менее расчетливы, чем представители других народов. Но зато мы пошире душой. Может быть, в этом отражается и величие нашей страны, и ее необозримые размеры. Мы пощедрее душой.
Walter Russell Mead, open souls and more generous. How does that stand up 6 years later?
Well, I'm sure Putin still believes it. But I think almost any country you'd have people saying, our people believe that selfishness is not enough. There is some moral imperative that is greater than what we have. So a lot of this is simply Russian chauvinism dressed up as some kind of philosophical reflection. I think the idea that Russia is enormous in size because its people are so generous would strike many of its neighbors as a truly odd idea. Many of Russia's neighbors think of the Russians as particularly grasping and ambitious, or at least of Russia's leaders that way.
And Walter, can I follow up with you in this sense? We talked earlier about the gulf that you see between the West and Russia. Is this cultural antagonism, do you think that's part of the gulf?
Well, yes. I think the best American writer on Russia and on American-Russian relations is still George Kennan. And Kennan talked about how there's a mix of inferiority and superiority complex when Russians look at the West, particularly, again, Russian officials. But he says that the arts and the methods by which it's necessary to govern Russia create a much more authoritarian, repressive society, that the rulers of the society both need an enemy to justify the continued repression that their rule requires, and also need a kind of an ideology that will justify their hostility and their response. And I think while many, many individual Russians and Russian society has moved past this in some ways, it's clear that President Putin has not.
Let me do one more follow-up with you, because I happen to have a George Kennan quote here, the author, of course, of the famous telegram in 1946, in which he articulated the containment strategy, and it included this line describing Soviet power as impervious to logic of reason, and it is highly sensitive to logic of force. Are we still there all these years later, reason versus force?
I'm afraid that for Putin, he is simply not impressed and overawed by the logic of Western leaders, by the pleas about the justice of the Ukrainian cause, or the international laws, the agreements that Russia has signed. That's really not the issue for him. It is, I'm afraid, again, force.
Yvonne, I want to play a clip now from a previous program we did here on TVO, on the agenda, and you were part of it, which is why I want to put this to you. It included Alexander Dugin, who was called Putin's brain once upon a time, and this is what he had to say about the nature of the antagonism between Russia and Western liberal tradition. Let's watch the clip, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon.
We understand human, to be human differently from the West, and we want to affirm and to defend our understanding of human nature that is our historically, religiously, culturally, and for example, coming into modernity, Russia preferred communism and not liberalism, precisely because that we understand human nature differently. That is kind of holistic vision. So now we are not anymore communist. We are not Tsarist regime, but we are the same. We are Russians as always. We have been, so we are anthropologically holistic. So our understanding of human nature is incompatible with liberalism and with Western, Anglo-Saxon above all, a system of values.
Inconsistent with liberalism. Can you again help us understand this cultural hostility between Russia and the West?
This cultural hostility comes that, and Mr. Dugin, honestly speaking, is slightly overvalued as being Mr. Putin's brain. I don't know. I do believe that Mr. Putin probably is Mr. Putin's brain. But there's three things which, in my view, are important. One is this distinctive nature of Russia's civilization. It is shared by Dugin, it's shared by everybody. In a certain way, Mr. Putin very much started to think in these civilizational terms, and he believes that he's not alone in this. He's seeing the Chinese go this way. So this is not simply states, they're old civilizations. He's going back to Gumilyov and others. The second thing that, in my view, very much shapes also the fears is that the demographic decline of Russia in the last years is quite important for President Putin. In the last 3 months, particularly after publishing his essay from the summer, 3 times he made the same comment. He said, if it was not for the revolution, if it was not for the disintegration of the Soviet Union, today Russians were going to be 500 million people. But they are not 500 million people. And basically, Russia lost a lot of people during the pandemic. And Russian birth rates also have been declining. And this fear that the demographic body of the Russian civilization is running away, that Ukraine can run away, that Belarus is running away. I do believe that this thinking, not simply in civilizational, but demographic terms, are very important. But the third element is Mr. Putin himself has created a regime which is so much about Putin and so much centered on him that probably he very much admires some of his predecessors. My fear is that he does not have much trust in his successors. And this comes the idea of timing. You want to fix it now. This messianism is, if I'm not going to do it now, if I'm not going to reunify Russian lands and Russian people, nobody else can do it. And I believe this messianism was not there all the time. Probably it changes when you stay in power for 20 years of a political regime like this. But you can see it very much now as a man who is not talking about real people. Kind of, he's talking about history with capital H. And this is why making any compromises, becoming political in a traditional sense, is so difficult for him.
Lynn, let me get you to weigh in on this issue of cultural hostility between the two countries, in as much as, I mean, Russia has a phenomenal cultural history. It has phenomenal culture. Do the Russian people see themselves as having a culture superior to that of the United States, for example?
Well, I think there's some elements that certainly do. You know, part of, I think, what has been so spectacular about some elements of Russian history reflects an idea that we were just talking about. And that is this, that Russia, because of its size, because of its expanse, because of its fact that it is both in Europe and in Asia, because it is both of East and of West, that it has defined itself as something unique. Whereas in the 17th and 18th century, in the beginning of the Romanov period, Russians felt insecure vis-a-vis the West through military exploits and through the expansion of empire. They gained a sense of confidence in their own power. And I think part of the great culture that we see on display in the 19th century, whether it is Pushkin or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, comes from this tension and this grappling between what it means to be Russian, of Europe or of Asia or something unique. And I think what Putin has done is he has taken that and embraced the Slavophile elements of it to justify his understanding of history and the fact that Russia gets its legitimacy from this these selective parts of heroism and sacrifice in the Russian past.
Okay, let me do a follow-up, though, with you, Lynn, and that is, and admittedly, you know, Canada and Russia, while they're both big countries, they are very different countries. But I can't imagine any Canadian saying, we've got a superior culture to yours, to anybody's. I mean, they'd say it's different, they'd say it's distinctive, but they'd never use the word better or superior. Do Russians feel comfortable saying, we have a superior culture to the rest of the world?
Well, I would hate to speak for all Russians, and I certainly never would. And many of the Russians that I know are more liberally inclined and with a direction towards Europe and the West and Canada and the U.S. But I would say that Putin has convinced himself of this. You know, for a long time, I thought that a lot of the ideas that he shared, that we saw in this clip that you played from 2015, 2016 about Ruski Mir, that this was just something he was selling to the people and to the larger world to justify his own aggrandized view of where Russia should be in the world. But over the last 2 weeks, I've come to think that he has bought his own sale of goods. And so I think it would be hard to say that the Russian people as a whole would champion themselves as somehow superior culturally, politically, or otherwise. But I think Vladimir Putin certainly does.
Seva, let's try this. When Russians say that the West does not respect them, are they in effect saying they don't want to be judged by Western standards?
Well, a lot of this discussion is civilizational discourse nonsense imported right from the 19th century. The Dugin clip, the Putin clip, the idea that some civilizations have the right values and some are moral and some understand the human conditions. And conveniently enough, the speaker usually belongs to the moral civilization with the right values. And this is not unique to Russia. Samuel Huntington's argument about the clash of civilizations, the same thing. The Anglo-Saxons were the torchbearers of humanity. And it's the same tired argument here. The Russians hold special moral values that the decadent West does not. It's infantile. It reduces people's personalities to a stock character. So whether Putin believes it or not, I think is an important question. But in terms of whether it actually explains what is happening, I have doubts about that.
Well, follow up if you would. It may be infantile, but do you think it's motivating what's going on right now?
Well, in the sense that it's cover for Russian imperialism, absolutely. in the same way that, say, Manifest Destiny was running cover for American imperialism. I don't think we need to intellectualize what is essentially an imperial project, one that, from Putin's perspective, doesn't just deny the agency of the people, but their existence.
All right, let's share some polling numbers now. These are from a Russian polling organization called Levada, the Levada Center. And let's stipulate that all of the numbers we're about to share, all of this polling was done in the field before February 24th, before the incursion into Ukraine. Do you generally approve or disapprove of Vladimir Putin's activities? That was the question. 69% approving in January of 2022, 71%, essentially the same, in February of 2022. How about disapprove? Only 29% and only 27%. So this man was extremely popular, if these surveys are to be believed. What about views on Ukraine? This one goes back to November of 2021. Who had a negative attitude about Ukrainians? 43% back in November of 2021. How about in February? It actually got higher. So as the drumbeat towards war was pounding more loudly, negative attitudes towards Ukraine increased. Let's do a third question. Who is responsible, they surveyed, who is responsible for the crisis in Ukraine? And the options offered were the United States or NATO, in which half the people said, yes, it's their fault. How about Ukraine itself? Only 16%. How about Russia? Not surprisingly, only 4%. Okay, again, stipulating these numbers are pre-Feb 24. Yvonne, let me ask you, you're the closest to all of this right now among all of us here. Do you have any reason to believe these numbers are any different today?
No, I don't believe that this has changed dramatically. It's interesting to see how these numbers are going to be in 3 months, in 6 months. And the story is the following. Paradoxically, President Putin did not prepare the Russian population for the war that he started. In my view, he very much wanted to do something that he did with Crimea in 2014. He believed that it's not a war. He believed it's a special operation, that it's going to take him 2 weeks and he's going to get Zelensky out, and then he's going to announce to the public just a victory. And now, as you see to what extent the Russian government is trying to put totally unprecedented control over the media, closing all opposition-minded media, but also threatening with prison of 15 years anybody who is critical to the war effort, you understand something very important. The Russian government this time does not have a good narrative to explain to its own people why their sons are going to die in Ukraine. And this is why we listen to all this story about nuclear and that basically Ukraine is going to have the atomic bomb. Because in the Russian and the Putin narrative, you're never fighting Ukrainians. You're fighting only traitors, you're fighting the West, you're fighting Nazis. But then people see that all these kind of Ukrainians that they know, their relatives, they have colleagues, are really resisting. And in my view, this problem with the narrative is a huge problem. It's not simply about the sanctions. You cannot hide this war because of the sanctions, but it's also not easy to explain this war. But Russian society, in a certain way, was very much shaped by the experience of the World War II. And of course, it was a great effort. President Putin did everything to exploit this effort. So any war that he's fighting is a kind of a continuation of the World War II. I do believe that now, if you have an opinion poll, he's still going to be very popular. It's interesting to see how this is going to be in 100 days, in 200 days.
Okay, Seva, we know that when Canadian pollsters in a relatively free country with charter rights, when Canadian pollsters call people and ask them for their opinions, some Canadians don't necessarily tell the truth to pollsters because they sometimes tell pollsters what they think they want to hear. How reliable do you think these numbers are as a reflection of the average Russian's point of view?
Well, I think we have to be very careful with the numbers, especially now. But we should not dismiss the fact that there is popular support for Putin's actions. And I think there's going to be two major countervailing tendencies in Russian public opinion. The pro-Putin sentiment, driven by the relentless state propaganda, driven by Western sanctions, which will be unpopular, and the anti-Putin sentiment, which will be driven by the economic collapse and political repression. And my hope is that the anti-Putin sentiment will win out, but there is a real resonance among at least a part of the Russian population that sees threats and enemies everywhere, that will see this as a righteous fight with some help from, like I said, relentless state propaganda, which is what we're seeing on Russian TV.
Lynn, I'm going to set up this next question to you with a bit of a story here, and let's admit off the top, it's sometimes dangerous to extrapolate too much from an anecdote, but I'm going to embrace the danger here and put this anecdote to you and see what you have to say. Eric Satter, the American writer, recalls standing in a lineup for groceries in the 1980s in Moscow, and he observed a loud disagreement among people. One man was angry about the fact that anything he wanted to buy they didn't seem to have, and upset about having to stand in long lines and wait, at which point an elderly woman apparently said, "Never mind the lineups, the whole world is afraid of us." Do you sense that Russians are proud about being able to get respect through intimidation?
Oh, that's a tough question. I would say, I don't know if they're proud about getting respect through intimidation. I would say that they were aggrieved by the absence of that ability. So that story really resonates with me. The first time I ever did research in Russia was in 1996. And these were not good days for Russia. And Putin often refers to this period as smutное время, the new smutное время, or time of troubles, which refers to a time in Russian history in the early 17th century when Russia was beset by invaders and disorder and civil war and the like. And so I think that the absence of having any power on the world stage in terms of being pitied rather than feared, I think that surely resonates with Russians as it probably would with most peoples who had belonged to a nation or an empire that had been able to exert its influence on the world stage and suddenly found that taken away. Putin often refers to himself in ways that it almost makes him seem like an aggrieved crusader. And so I think the impotence that Russians felt in the 1960s is a real wound that continues to linger.
Walter, again, at the risk of oversimplifying, what do you think of the perception that Americans want to be loved, Russians want to be feared?
Well, I would say the Russians seem to be having more success in their goals than the Americans are, if that is the goal. I do think there is a sense in Russia that the world is a dangerous place. You think about Russian history, some of the dangers, it's true, have come from inside Russia, like the Communist Party, but a history of invasion, a history of sort of constant threat from East and West. Sense today, whether it's from Islamist terrorists and rebels in the South, China in the East, NATO and Europe in the West, Russia, there is a kind of a sense that the wagons need to be circled, the people are in danger, and maybe we are safer if others fear us. I think that's there, but let's not forget this other Russia. There is a liberal Russia. There is a humanistic Russia. I think all of us on this panel have traveled in Russia and know many people in Russia who are absolutely citizens of the world, fantastic, cultured people, deeply immersed in Russian history, but also very open to values and ideas that come from around the world. And to simply say that Putin and the Putinistas are Russia is to concede a point I really don't think we should ever concede.
Understood, and absolutely fair point. Yvonne, again, you being over there and in the midst of all of this, I want to try this on with you. We've heard, there have been some very unusual examples of anti-Russian behavior since this war started. Everything from calls in Canada and the United States to prevent Russian hockey players from playing even junior hockey, let alone in the National Hockey League, to restaurants not wanting to serve Russian people, to vandalism at Russian restaurants. Anyway, we're seeing lots of examples of this. How do you sense the rising hostility to Russians from your perch in Europe?
Listen, you have it, and to be honest, I very much agree with Walter, and I'm very much worried by this. First of all, there are Russians in Russia who oppose the war. There are almost 2 million people that signed different petitions. You cannot imagine what kind of a risk these people are taking. You cannot imagine how difficult it is in this early moment in which the vote is divided between us and the enemies to say, no, we are the guilty party. And when we're not trying to distinguish between those people who are basically trying to defend basic human values in this situation and treating them simply like Russians, I do believe this is the worst that we can do about the future relations with post-Putin Russia. Nevertheless, when this post-Putin Russia is going to arrive, and nevertheless how it's going to look. I was recently talking to a close friend of mine. She's a cultural figure. She started one of these first petitions. And she said, when I was in Russia, I was treated as if I'm a Ukrainian because I'm a traitor. And then when I went out of Russia, I was treated like a Russian. My credit card didn't work. People basically who don't know me, doesn't want to speak to me. I do believe that it's so important to make a distinctions. Russia is not simply Putin. Even more, there are people who are taking a risk which is comparable to the risk that people are taking in the occupied and besieged Ukrainian cities. And if we're not going to make this distinction, I do believe we're going to have a huge problem in the future trying to explain to people why we reduce the country to one man.
Seva, can I get you to follow up on that? How concerned are you that people are not making the distinction between Russia and Putin?
Well, I do want to say, as a Russian, somebody who was born in the Soviet Union and who grew up there and speaks the language, it's not the primary concern for me at the moment. I think the people of Ukraine are the ones that are suffering more. But as with anywhere, collective guilt is a very bad place to go historically. And holding regular people responsible for their government's crimes is the logic of a terrorist. If a European leader had called in 2003 to expel American students because of the US invasion, people would have said that's idiotic, and they would have been right. And yet here we are. So I, as much as Putin deserves the scrutiny and the venom and the suspicion, I think we will see a lot of another decade of, well, everything bad that happens in Western society must be tied to the Russians. And I hope people don't automatically make that connection as a way to distract from the internal problems of the West as well.
Lynn, I note the University of Milan canceled a course on Dostoevsky. Now, people did make a fuss and they reinstated the course, but I mean, how much of this stuff are you seeing in your life?
Not too much yet, thankfully. Although I was talking to a student about trying to fill some gaps in terms of learning and feeling motivated, and I suggested some Dostoevsky. And the student said, oh, right now, I don't think I want to, but I'm hoping that that is transitory because I think it is vital, as the other guests have said, that we distinguish Putin from the Russian people. And for the Russians have dealt with Putin and his authoritarian ways for many years now, 2 decades. And so I think it's really important that we continue to make those distinctions. And I hope that what we saw in Milan does not repeat itself anywhere else at other universities.
Walter, less than 2 minutes to go, and I'm going to ask you a very unusual question. You've been on this program many times. I don't think we've ever talked about hockey, but I'm going to ask you a final question about hockey. You know, one of the greatest hockey players in the world plays for the home team in the city in which you live. Alex Ovechkin, Washington Capitals. He's still got a picture of himself and Putin on his Instagram feed. On the other hand, he's come out, even though he is close to Putin, and he has said, we don't want any more war. We are not for war. When people go to Capitals games, should they boo him?
I really don't think so. On the other hand, I'm told that fans at hockey games sometimes behave emotionally rather than rationally. I hear this as a rumor. But I would say it really is important to hold our venom for the actual bad guys. And a Russian at this moment who talks about wanting peace is not necessarily a bad guy.
And what should we say to those? I mean, I heard Wayne Gretzky say it, I don't know, a week or so ago, about the notion of not allowing Russian hockey players to participate in future tournaments and this kind of thing. What should we do with those who say, let's just boycott everything having to do with Russia right now until they get out of Ukraine?
Well, I personally tend to frown on boycotts, and I think exchanges are good. One of the discoveries we made after the Cold War was that our exchange programs with Soviets and others had done a lot to undermine communism because it exposed them to the reality of non-communist society. So I would actually think that the more Russians that can come out into the rest of the world, get out of the propaganda sphere of Putin, journalism, and so on, and meet other people and see how the world is reacting to what's happening in Ukraine. I think that's information that needs to get back into Russia, and these person-to-person contacts can be a very good way of doing it.
Very good. I want to thank the four of you for coming on to TVO tonight and helping us out with this discussion. Ivan Krastev, Walter Russell Mead, Lynn Hartnett, Seva Gunitsky. It's been great to have you on our program tonight. Be well, everybody.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.